Hey guys, so I just wanted to hop on real quick before the video starts and point out a couple of things about this video. So basically, I thought it'd be really fun to go back on some of the previous theory documentaries and look at some of the coolest theory and composition things that basically just kind of blew my mind and were really cool things that I learned, and I thought that you guys can benefit from it too. So yes, there are also timestamps, so feel free to go throughout them and pick out which ones you want to see the most. And this is also just a thank you for having such a really good 2023 into 2024. I have a lot of really big videos coming up in the future, and a lot of little ones of going back to using more of the chalkboard and showing you guys more theory stuff. But without further ado, let's get to the video. So Crazy Train basically makes really good use of the minor sixth interval, okay? So the minor sixth interval is basically if we're in a minor key and we go up a sixth, there's your minor sixth interval, okay? It has a very dissonant sound to it. The minor sixth interval is nothing new. It's been used for centuries, but the thing is, in rock and metal, we haven't really gotten too much a dissonance like the minor sixth interval. And the main thing that I noticed about the Crazy Train riff is the fact that it influenced a lot of heavy metal going on for generations in the future. A good example of this would be a comparison to Eurythmics' 1983 song, Sweet Dreams. Being that Crazy Train only came out a couple of years prior to this, Sweet Dreams has a very similar feel to it in terms of the repeating eighth notes on the synthesizer, while also making use of the minor sixth. The main differences with Sweet Dreams, of course, is that we do explore other diatonic chords in the key of C minor, whereas in Crazy Train in the riff, we're mostly exploring F minor and A major. But what's interesting is if I transpose the Sweet Dreams synthesizer lick from C minor to F sharp minor, let's see if it sounds any similar to Crazy Train. Yeah, it sounds pretty close, but I still don't think it has that exact same feel, and of course this isn't anything that would be considered copying, but the main thing is that in rock and metal, people were starting to use more interesting stuff as soon as Randy started bringing these to the table. Another set of proof that I have is just looking at the genre now called metalcore. In metalcore, the minor sixth interval is perhaps the most common interval in this entire genre. Just listen to these riffs with the minor sixth interval. Tornado of Souls. I'm sure this is the big one that you're all looking forward to, and it's for good reason. Now, the song widely blew up out of all the tracks, and it's really considered one of the best metal songs in history, especially because of Marty's guitar solo. Now, the song is in the key of B minor. Now, B minor is the relative minor of D major, okay? So all I'd have to do is get rid of this. All you have to do to figure out what the sharps are is know that the first sharp starts on F sharp, and then from there you literally go up in fifths as well. So the keys you go up in fifths, and the key signature you up in fifths. Do not get those two confused, but they do the same things with the formula. So if we're in the key of C major, go up a fifth. We're at G major. That's going to have an F sharp. Go up a fifth from G major. That's D major. That's going to have, bring the F sharp over. Then you're going to have up a fifth from F sharp, which is C sharp. You literally have to just keep going up in fifths clockwise. So the song basically follows a 1-5-6-4 chord progression, and especially in the chorus and the guitar solo, it's basically being played over a B, G, E, F sharp, and then into an A natural and an A sharp, making it extra suspenseful. Now, since these were power chords, Marty's able to tease our ears while using an E minor to an E major arpeggio, and the iconic arpeggios at the 34th measure following the chords underneath, with the exception of the D diminished arpeggio measure 38. Marty shows us a really good example of how to shred with still having iconic melodies and not sound too robotic. This guitar solo basically broke metal because of how awesome and melodic it was, while still being really shreddy and really iconic and fast. For many, many years, people have covered this hundreds and hundreds of times, and it's a really good example of how having really strong melodies can really get your guitar solo to be as good as it can be. Thus, in the fourth track is titled Air. Jason was never afraid to show off his fingerstyle skills and his incredible knowledge of counterpoints. After the synth intro, we're faced with some incredibly difficult finger-picking patterns that would wound up sounding extremely pleasant to our ears. This is because of his use of counter melodies in the bass, as well as his lovely treble melodies that he explores in D minor and then B minor. Jason also has a really awesome rendition of this with an orchestra playing it. I highly recommend you check it out. So if you haven't heard of counterpoint yet, this might be the perfect song for you to kind of delve into it, because Bach was the counterpoint master back in the day, and Jason did a really good job of using counterpoint. And all counterpoint is when two voices are playing at the same time, but they're moving in different directions, okay? And when you use counterpoint versus typical harmonies, if done properly, it can sound absolutely beautiful. So this is my harmonic analysis of Air. So this is the finger picking part. And what I've noticed is that Jason, again, is very good at things like modulation. So let's take a look at the first modulation that I spotted. So I've labeled this 6 chord as in D minor, but underneath I've wrote this as a 1 chord in G minor. So this would be our pivot chord, if you were to call it, okay? And Jason does this a lot more. He also comes back to D, like over here. Jason did a lot of inversions, as we called it. So if you ever see something with a 6, that means that it's first inversion. And if you ever see something with a 6/4, like over here, that would mean that it is second inversion. So that would mean that the 5th is on the bottom. So right here, Jason was really good with using a secondary dominant chord and then going to a regular dominant chord. This is a very common thing that you can do. And the other modulation that I found was right down here. He played a 5 first inversion chord with the C sharp on the bottom in the key of D minor. But in fact, I would label that as a major 7 chord in B minor, because we eventually start getting introduced into other accidentals like this F sharp. So it can be thought of as this F sharp was our pivot note, as you'd call it. And for the rest of it, we are kind of sticking in B minor. And what Jason really likes to do is do things like counterpoint, where things are moving in different directions. Like in this section over here, it can be very evident that things are moving up here and then things are moving down, going over here. So the rest of Air features a total of 4 guitars, making it very similar aspects of modulation and counterpoint. And it's a wild ride, and I'd highly recommend listening to it all the way through and following a score. Lead to Rest features a beautiful guitar intro that we need to briefly talk about, as it sets us up for more of his style in the future. Using a D standard tuning, we hear a strange G minor chord progression. On a first listen, we can already tell some weird stuff is happening, and mostly has to do with the second guitar part, basically outlining chromaticism. Guitar 1 is simply doing a 1 add 9 and then into a 4 chord, into a D sus4, and then back to our 1. Putting them together, the chords can be outlined as follows: G minor, F sharp minor, B flat, C, E flat 7, D7, and G minor. Going from G minor to F sharp minor is a common dark chord progression. Composers like Danny Elfman use this a lot for their dark fantasy films. And then using an E flat 7 makes us feel like we want B flat to be tonicized, which wouldn't be too odd considering it's the relative major of G minor. And then using a D7 almost as a deceptive cadence for finally tonicizing G minor was very clever. Next song, being Voice of the Soul, is a beautiful intro. And we hear some really cool sounding acoustic guitar work using D minor with some very classical sounding lead guitar melodies. And it really is some of his best work to show someone who's never heard of Chuck before. We modulate into G minor soon after, and overall it's just a beautiful song. And it's kind of amazing how the harmonies and melodies work so incredibly well together. Zombie Ritual. So the chord progression follows a simple 1-6-5 in G minor, while the lead guitar uses a Phrygian dominant. Now what's interesting is we already modulate into D minor when the fast drums kick in. But strangely, we use a major third in D minor or F sharp, and this quickly resolves into the minor third and then into the dominant chord, which would be A major, to further lock in D minor. Now, on this channel, we've talked a lot about modulation, modal mixture, and all that good stuff. And being that Alexi Laiho of Children of Bodom was an expert at both of these, you'll notice a lot of really cool similarities between Chuck and Alexi. Now, the major third is an extremely common aspect of modal mixture, basically borrowing from the parallel major D major. Looking at the difference between D major and D minor, it's weird to think that an F sharp would somehow make things even more dissonant. So when composing like this, context is absolutely key. And a modulation from G minor into D minor really isn't that far off, only one flat difference in the circle of fifths. Now, clearly, Chuck had some sort of influence from thrash metal, maybe with Megadeth because of the chromaticism in measure 56, and in the guitar solo, we switch into A minor, sometimes throwing in the raised 7th, using some really impressive octave jumps and shred runs. And now, using that raised 7th is what's going to imply the dominant chord and the diminished chord, giving us that extra nice dissonance. Let's begin with Welcome Back, Oh Sleepy Dreamer. So in the very beginning of the track, we are introduced with a percussive pulse underneath F sharp minor. We're simultaneously hearing a buildup of strings and a piano motif, basically covering the chords of F sharp minor, D minor, and C sharp. So that chord progression is the equivalent of a 1, a 6, and a 5 chord progression, only the 6th chord is minor instead of major. You see, diatonic chords in any minor key are going to look like this. When a composer changes the chords outside of this diatonic scale, it can alter the tune immensely. Listen to how this sounds with a regular 6th chord in there. It's really not as dark and as epic. Now the main orchestrator, aka the lead guitarist of Lorna Shore, Adam D'Amico, he explains how he works with the orchestration and the heavy guitars.
Would you say that you that part of it makes it easier or harder to write the songs as you
the orchestration?
The orchestra, whatever other element we'll call it additional elements.
So for me, like a lot of the like post-production stuff, like all the orchestration, all the all that stuff, like it really is just reinforcement of guitar and drums. So it's not like they're doing counter things to it. It's just like these are already themes that exist, like in it. It's just kind of it's working in tandem with it. So
okay.
Adam clearly understands that themes written on the guitar or any instrument can be reinforced through synths, orchestration, etc., and they do no more than complement each other. Funny enough, in Symphony X's album Underworld, in the overture, Michael Romeo does a similar chord progression in F minor, utilizing that same minor 6 chord. But anyways, before the heavy tempo changes come in, we hear a cool dark A5 to F5 passing tones. It's a really solid way to end the phrase. The rising of the strings before the blech is really neat, and you'll notice that a lot in this album. It's the equivalent of a drop in EDM. This little melody of F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, A, and then back to F is a really nice example of harmonic minor. But it more so implies that minor 6 chord. And at 1 minute and 50 seconds, we get a cool A sharp minor chord to C sharp minor. This would be a good example of a chromatic mediant chord progression. Using A sharp minor, the third of the chord is C sharp. We simply build the minor triad off of C sharp and we're good to go. Alright, getting into the tempo change, we're really getting into some dark composition. Using some simple chromaticism while the vocals mainly take the center stage. The F sharp harmonic minor dissonance, about 2 minutes and 34 seconds in, simply falls under the same ordeal of the minor 6 chord, and continues in F sharp minor with these aspects throughout the rest of the song. In the guitar solo, we do hear that A sharp minor chord, making the Roman numeral appear as this. Basically, in F sharp minor, we typically have our 3 chord being an A major chord, but instead, we're having an A sharp minor chord. So what we have to do with the Roman numeral is add a little sharp next to it to make sure you sharp the root, and then create a minor triad or just a lowercase Roman numeral. The next song on the record, Into the Earth, in my opinion, has even more interesting chords. The key of introduction is F minor, so 4 flats in the key signature. The chord progressions are following similar aspects of the previous song, but let's hear them more in depth and analyze them. At first, a simple 1-5, but in this section, we have F minor to A flat minor, which is a chromatic median. We have F minor to C sharp, which is that minor 6 chord progression. And then we have F minor to C. As you can see, we're simply playing around with chord borrowing, or borrowing chords from other keys. Most of the chord progressions I've found in this song have been of similar nature, and this is a good example of using minor chords constantly but still sounding really interesting. Gives the song a really dark and epic feel. Last Rites, loved to death. Now hearing the song right out of the gate, it's clearly inspired by Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. This is something that is not very surprising, as Dave Mustaine is a huge fan of Michael Schenker, who had a lot of classical influence, and I think that inspired Dave to pick up on some of that classical stuff as well. But anyways, being that Toccata and Fugue is in D minor, as the title says, this is also starting out in D minor with the piano. Now, we're going to talk really quick about D harmonic minor because you need to understand what this scale actually is. So the key of D minor has 1 flat in it, and that is going to be B flat. Boom, right there. Okay, so to make a D minor scale, all we have to do is use the whole step, half step method of the minor scale, okay, which is going to be whole, half, whole, half, whole. Now taking a look at this scale, we have D minor. Now to make it harmonic, all we have to do is raise the 7th note, which is C. So instead of C, we're going to be playing a C sharp. Now, ignoring my sloppy handwriting on this, all we have to know is that the raised leading tone, or the raised C sharp, is basically going to impact the chords that we use in these kinds of songs that use this scale. And what I mean by that is whenever we have something like a 5 chord, right? So if we play a 5 chord in this key right here, we'd have to make that C a C sharp, right? So then you'd have an A major chord, and that would be called your dominant chord. You can even add a G in there to make it a dominant 7 chord, and that gives you a lot of tension and resolution. The same thing works with the diminished 7 chord, which we would start on the note C sharp and stack it in minor thirds. So C sharp, E, G, and then a B flat in there. So this was a really neat way to begin the album. It was really interesting to hear a lot of really cool guitar runs and a lot of descending minor scales underneath. It was a really strange way of starting off Megadeth's entire career, and I think that really set them apart from a lot of these other thrash metal bands. Now, I've talked a ton about modulation on this channel, and you're gonna need to know what modulation is as we go forward, and it's gonna start with this song. So after the piano intro, we basically head right into A minor, and basically the riff uses a flat 2 and an augmented 6 interval of F sharp. So being that we're in A minor, it's a really easy scale to understand because in the key signature, there are no sharps and there are no flats. So that's really easy. Now, what does the flat 2 mean? Well, that basically means you go to the second scale degree, which is B, and you make it a B flat. This is a really common thing that we do in metal music. Okay, so if we have that flatted 2 in there, we also need that augmented 6th interval, right? So augmented means raised. Okay, so we're going to go to the 6th and move it up a half step. It almost kind of looks like we're in E minor with a flatted 5th or something like that, but for now we're going to stick to it, calling it a harmonic minor, just with those accidentals in there when they come up. So there's a lot of chromaticism happening in the song. We get a really solid solo from Dave with some pentatonic scales, some blues scales, and all that good stuff, all the stuff that Dave is notorious for doing, especially in his early days. So as I keep explaining things, the pentatonic scale is just a 5-note scale. So we're going to take the minor scale, but we're going to get rid of the 2 and we're going to get rid of the 6, okay? And then the blues scale is the same exact scale, except we're going to add the flatted 5th in there. So being that the solo is on top of an A minor riff and an F sharp minor riff, Dave does a great job of changing the keys but still keeping the same kind of feel of the solo. It's a really good thing that guitarists can do that, is that we can kind of keep the same style but go into different keys. Now it's kind of similar to what Alexi Laiho did in some of his work with Children of Bodom. If you remember the documentary that I made on that, if you haven't seen it, definitely go check it out. But in his songwriting, using non-diatonic chords and non-diatonic notes when writing riffs and solos, especially when changing keys, is a really awesome thing that we can do. Runnin' with the Devil, which is the very first song on their self-titled album from 1978. So the tuning is a half step down, but we're just going to be referencing it in E standard just to make things a little bit easier to digest. But just know that that was the tuning for this entire album that they did end up using. So right off the bat, this is the chord progression for Runnin' with the Devil. We have C, D, D, G, A, E, and yes, those are all major chords. What key is Runnin' with the Devil in? Because this chord progression is really weird and it kind of doesn't really make any sense off the bat. So let's see what we can figure out. So right off the bat, the first thing to listen to is the bass, of course, because the bass usually tells us everything. Now the bass is honestly just holding a quarter note of hitting E. Bow, 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 bow. Which is very, very evident that maybe we just are in the key of E. It might be a little weird that we have an A major chord right here. So we'll talk about that and we'll talk about the possibilities that we have. See, the weird part is if we use this E chord as a dominant chord, it actually sounds more like we should resolve into the key of A. So initially, if I play through this and I play all these chords and then I stop at an A, play an E chord, and then I go resolve back to the A, it's going to sound like essential completion. So it's like, what are we in the key of A major? Well, that wouldn't be too weird considering the fact that the bass note is playing an E, which is the 5th of A, and that's not too weird. But we're going to go over 3 different possibilities of what Runnin' with the Devil is actually doing in the intro. The first possibility is the one that we just talked about, where we're in the key of A major. The E chord is the dominant chord, which would be at the end of the progression, which can kind of make sense. We would just have to label certain things a little bit weird, because this would technically be considered a flat 3 chord, kind of like this. That would technically be the correct Roman numeral for that. And with the G chord, if we were in the key of A major, then that would be a flat 7 chord, because as we know, in the key signature of A major, we have a G sharp. Now, it's not horrible, but it's also maybe not the best thing. So let's take a look at some of the other possibilities. The second way is a really cool way that I actually really like, but may still not be the answer, but check this out. It's pretty nice. So if we take a look at this as not in the key of E minor, but in the relative major of G major, that could potentially work, because all these chords would make kind of enough sense, except for the E major chord, but we'll talk about that in a second here. But the big thing is the A major chord would actually be considered a secondary dominant chord, right? Because in the key of G major, the chord D major would be resolved after A major if we were using a secondary dominant chord. And it actually sounds kind of nice if we resolve this whole thing into D at the very end instead of E. So the third way would be an E Mixolydian scale, considering the bass line is holding E quarter notes, and it could make some sense because the resolution to A major, like we did over in example 1. However, even this example may not be correct because the accidentals with the rest of the chords really don't line up super great. But regardless of which possibility, this is a really good example of Eddie using chord borrowing, and when he kind of walks up the fretboard like that with those major triads, it sounds really good, and something like that is pretty impressive to kind of use and not really have any sort of diatonic center. So it's something to learn that going outside of the typical diatonic function of chords can be very beneficial for writing more spicier stuff. And the only really weird coincidence that I noticed is I can rewrite this whole chord progression and spell caged. I thought that was pretty interesting. But anyways, intro to Diary of a Madman is peculiar, not just for the chords, but for something else. So now a musician and guitar teacher named David Schramm made a very interesting article covering something that a few people in the world noticed, but not very many people knew about this. So now the first measure in Diary of a Madman basically makes use of an A7 sharp 4 chord. Now this chord, along with some of the other chords in this intro, were pointed towards a composer by the name of Leo Brouwer. Now Leo Brouwer being a Cuban composer from kind of around the time that Randy would have heard of this classical guitarist, it very much influenced this song. Leo's piece being his 6th etude. There are some, well, similarities to his chord progression next to Randy's Diary of a Madman. Let's check it out. First 7 measures, those chords are almost exactly the same and they sound extremely similar. Now they of course lead to different things, but since Randy was brought up with classical guitar and he was even taking classical lessons while he was on the road touring, it's not very surprising that he has all of these extra added little things from classical pieces. Now here's where things get a little bit rocky and shaky, is that a lot of people think that this was plagiarism or copying. Now, I've brought this up with my own classical guitar teacher because when I heard about this, I was like, oh my goodness, is this true? When I brought it up, my guitar teacher did end up saying that, yeah, and Leo Brouwer did know about it, and he was going to perhaps pursue legal action towards Randy, but Randy did end up passing away, so he ended up kind of dropping it. Now, I couldn't really find anything that exactly confirmed or denied this, but it is very interesting to see how similar these two sound. The main takeaway that I think people forget to understand is the fact that these chords probably would have never seen the light of day to most hard rock and heavy metal musicians at this time. And in general, I think it actually gave Mr. Leo Brouwer some more extra exposure, and it also promoted classical guitar to a lot of heavy metal fans and players. We need to move forward with a little bit more classical influence of Randy with this same exact song. Back to the Francisco Terreña, he does end up using sort of a very similar bass line to his famous Recuerdos de la Alhambra, which is one of the most famous classical guitar pieces of all time. Dedos de la Ambra makes use of tremolo in classical guitar. It's basically when your ring finger, middle finger, and your index finger, aka AMI, sequentially hits higher notes while the thumb is able to hit a nice bass line. And this sequence is a little more subtle with Diary of a Madman, as in after the intro into the A flat minor lick, we can basically hear the same bass line in both pieces.